Hello, my name is Olorotimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussion on uh, blacks are not a monolith in America. So, right now, what I want to do is provide some data, statistics, just to support my discussion. I'm describing who African Americans are, black Americans, that's descendants of African American slaves, African slaves. Um, some people describe themselves as foundational black Americans. I'm going to get into a discussion on that later on. But the purpose of this discussion is to help first generation, African Americans, first generation migrants from Africa. You see how difficult it is to, define these terms. Those like me, I'm from Nigeria, where from Africa, first generation, many have a misunderstanding of African Americans, and they soon find themselves embracing these uh, disparaging stereotypes and pervasive tropes about black Americans, which are, actually inaccurate. They're just nothing but derogatory and pejorative. Their legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. But I want to try and provide some data as I discuss uh, black Americans, how they're not a monolith, they're not a homogenous group. Yes, there's been tension between Nigerian Americans, Africans, new first generation, um, Americans from Africa, right? And black Americans or foundational black Americans. And I'm going to use some data now in this video to dispel some of these um, misnomers about black Americans. They're often dismissed as being uneducated, not liking education, as being lazy, as being welfare recipients, and all that. By the way, there's no welfare in America. America is not a welfare state like much of Europe is. Only the elderly, right, the elderly or disabled people, right, disabled persons or people who are mentally ill can receive, welfare in America. Or single mothers, right? Indigent single mothers, right? Those are the only people who can receive, what is akin to welfare. But black men, if you're able-bodied, you're not going to get welfare. The best welfare you're going to get if you don't have a job is to be in jail, right? They lock them, they're incarcerated. And so you have the prison industrial complex. I'm going to get into a discussion on that later on. But right now, I want to in order to try and debunk that broad brush definition of black Americans, which new first generation African migrants often become susceptible to because of the pervasive racism and legacy of Jim Crow and slavery. Uh, I want to provide some data just to show that these things are not backed by evidence. So I'm going to talk in terms of education, talk in terms of socioeconomics. Education gives us an insight into socioeconomics, so I'm going to use education, right? So blacks are often dismissed as poverty-stricken in America. If you look at the data, it actually indicates that yes, 20% of black Americans in America actually live below the poverty line, right? 20%, that's a lot, right? 20% of black Americans in America live below the poverty line. Black Americans constitute 13% of the American population, right? Roughly. And so 20% of black Americans live in, poverty line, right? Below the poverty line. And, but that 20% is also included in another group of low income tier people. That's black Americans. They're low income tier. That's about 45% of of them, 45% of Black Americans, which subsumes that 20% below the poverty line, they are a low income tier. So that's almost half of Black Americans in America live are low income, right? They're in the lower income tier in America, right? Um, you know, there's a legacy. Again, that's because of institutional, what I call institutional discreditation, right? Institutional discreditation. And I'm going to get into all of that later on in my further discussions. But above those, there's another group, about 46%, 46 to 47% of Black Americans are middle income tier, right? They're middle income tier. So, almost half as well. And above that middle income tier of Black Americans, 9% are upper income tier, just 9% of them, right? That includes the few people who are, that include, those billionaires I've talked about. Black Americans now have, roughly 14 billionaires, of course, and there's several, they're millionaires, and there are people who are high income earners. They're not billionaires or millionaires. Maybe they make six figures, right? So they put them in the high income tier. So roughly 9% of Black Americans, right? So half of Black Americans are in the lower income tier, 20% of those in poverty, on the poverty line, and another 46%, almost half as well, are middle income tier, right? Now, this is roughly almost commensurate, is measurable by, we can get a better insight by looking at the educational levels of Black Americans. So Black Americans, again, they're often dismissed as not liking education, not being educated. Now, take a look at the data though. Of the 13, Black Americans are 13% of the population of America. Now, of those Black Americans, I'm talking about foundational Black Americans, roughly almost 29%, about 29% of them have bachelor's degrees. 29% of them. Of course, before you can get a master's degree, you have to have a bachelor's degree. So of those that have bachelor, of those 29%, 9% of them go further and have a master's degree. So 9% of Black Americans have a master's degree. Of those 9%, of those, who have a bachelor's, before you can get a master's or PhD, you have to have a bachelor's. So of those 29, roughly 29.6 Black Americans who have a bachelor's degree, 1% of all Black Americans, right? 1.6 actually, 1.6% of all Black Americans hold a PhD. Now, if we compare them to the general American population, the general, that includes whites, includes Asian Americans, it includes Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, right? Everybody. If you take a look at the numbers, it includes Nigerian Americans, immigrants. The averages for all the races, for all Americans, the general American population, about 38.7% of all Americans have a bachelor's degree, right? So just about roughly 9% more than Black Americans who have a bachelor's degree. So of the general American population, the average, about 38% of them, of all Americans, have a bachelor's degree, right? On just under 39%, right? So 9% more than the rate for Black Americans, right? Of those who have master's degrees, roughly 11% to 14% of these have master's degrees. And then of PhDs, right, of general Americans, of Americans generally, all races, 2% of them, 2% of all Americans have a PhD, right? So just roughly less than double of the proportion of Black Americans who have a PhD. Black Americans with a PhD are 1.6%, right? 1.6% of Black Americans who have a PhD. And I'm just going to, so you see these numbers, right, are not so atrocious for black Americans when you compare them to white Americans. And especially when you consider the legacy. Yes, they're lower than than the national average. Black Americans' educational attainment level is lower than the general American average. But you have to, and it's actually the lowest of all the races, right? But you have to put it in context. When you put it in context with the legacy of slavery, right? Black Americans are the only ones who suffered chattel slavery for 3 centuries in America. And during chattel slavery, black American slaves that's black Americans, were prohibited from getting educated, right? It wasn't like slaves worked all day and if they wanted to spend their leisure, they could go and get a book or learn to read. No, they were banned from getting an education. If they were found with a book, found reading, found learning, there was a severe penalty for them. Sometimes they could be maimed. They could chop off their foot, their hand, or something. They would get, tons of lashes of the cane and all that, right? They would be punished. There was severe punishment for them. So it was illegal for blacks to get educated. Even after slavery, when we move into the 20th century, our 28th president, right? Woodrow Wilson, who was a known racist. He was the one who first filmed Birth of a Nation, that KKK movie, the racist KKK movie that celebrated the Ku Klux Klan, right? And also inspired the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, Woodrow Wilson was an avowed racist and segregationist. He institutionalized, right, he segregated the federal civil service. He was the first president, by the way, who appointed white people after a long streak of appointing black Americans to be ambassadors and the diplomatic envoys to Haiti, right? Haiti was an independent black republic, the first independent black republic in the Western Hemisphere. But Woodrow Wilson would appoint whites, would replace the black people who held those ambassadorial positions. It was understood, right? It was an unspoken understanding. It was an unspoken rule. It was understood that the ambassadors to Haiti and Liberia, another independent black republic which was in West Africa, right, were to be black Americans. But Woodrow Wilson replaced them with white people. And of course, he institutionalized, he segregated the federal civil service. So Woodrow Wilson, by the way, what I was trying to say was, he advocated that blacks should not be taught to read, right? He wanted to disenfranchise blacks completely. He wanted to stop them. He advocated that they shouldn't be taught to read, right? I do typically, I started this platform, by the way, to discuss American presidents. So I have several videos in which I talk about the biographies of American presidents. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the 20th president, the only president to have a PhD, was a Princeton graduate. He was a lawyer. He had several degrees. He was president of Princeton. But look, typically, people who are academics, they often advocate for more education for people. Woodrow Wilson was advocating that blacks shouldn't be educated, right? And so you have to have that backdrop, that understanding, place it in context. That why is it that blacks have lower educational attainment than the others? By the way, when I say that the national average for educational attainment, right, for Americans, where it's roughly over 38% for Americans generally, right, who have bachelor's degrees. Compare that to Nigerian Americans. Nigerians in America, according to the Pew Research Center, have 64% of Nigerian Americans have a bachelor's degree, right? Actually, Nigerian Americans are the most educated ethnic group in America, even more educated than Asian Americans, right? But that's because if you understand the context, Nigerian Americans, people that the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. government brings in, they self-select for educated people, right? Nigerians who value education. Yes, our culture values education, but so do Asians, right? But you have to understand, put things in context. Now, Asians Yeah, they have bachelors, they're educated, but they go into business. They don't keep going on to get PhD and things like that, like Nigerians do, right? So Nigerians, uh, and if you also consider in terms of white people, right? White men with a high school degree can earn six figures, can out earn blacks or Nigerian Americans, right? Nigerian Americans, right? They believe that, well, the path, at least in America, the path to their socioeconomic advancement would be through education, right? On the other hand, white men with a high school degree, diploma, can earn six figures, 500,000 in corporate jobs. The first investment bank I went to work for, when I worked in wealth management, my boss, who was a vice president, all right, he was a director, he was a vice president, one of my bosses, um, he had been a Wall Street trader before he moved to DC, right? He was an Italian American. He had just a high school diploma. He earned $500,000, just a high school diploma. Uh, Stan O'Neill is a black American man. He was the first black American to be CEO of a major investment bank. He was CEO of Merrill Lynch. Stan O'Neill he had an MBA from Harvard Business School, but the CEO who mentored him and who was he was a white guy before him at Merrill Lynch had just a high school diploma, right? So whites can get by the institutional in the institutions in America allow white men at least to get by with just a high school or to succeed with less, right? While there's a double standard, there's a higher requirement for blacks to be able to scale a similar level of success. So there's this institutional discreditation of black people, and you can understand this with recent events, right? Although this guy, Jason Arde, who recently unalived himself, the professor of sociology at Cambridge University, the famous Cambridge University in England, in the United Kingdom, who was accused of plagiarism, and he resigned. He subsequently unalived himself or committed suicide. That's what they say. It's still speculated from the distress and the institutional discreditation, right? So although that's in UK, but you see, it's like England is starting to copy what goes on in America, right? Just not too long ago, remember, just a few years ago, the first black president of Harvard University, the prestigious Harvard University, Professor Claudine Gay, right? She's a professor of economics, Harvard educated, taught at Harvard, right? She became the first black president of Harvard University, second female to be president of Harvard University. She started her tenure July 1st, 2023. She was forced to resign. She resigned after institutional discreditation again, right? Institutional discreditation. She resigned 6 months after, in January 2024, when they started accusing her of plagiarism. Now, do whites plagiarize? President Joe Biden became president, even though everybody knows that, well, they said he plagiarized while he was in school, in college or law school or something like that. There are many people who plagiarize, who've been whites. They don't suffer the same blowback, the same backlash, right? And it's so. Anyway, I can devote another video to institutional discreditation, but I'm just trying to provide that picture, right? That I think saying that blacks, casting aspersions on blacks generally, besmirching them, saying, well, blacks don't like education, when in fact about 29.6% of them, right, have bachelor's degrees. And, compared to the general American population, 39% of Americans, 38.7% of Americans generally have a bachelor's degree, right? In terms of PhD, 1.6 black Americans have a PhD. General American population, just 2% of Americans have a PhD, right? By the way, for Nigerian Americans, over 4% of Nigerian Americans have a PhD, have a doctoral PhD. So, but we don't say Americans are uneducated, right? We don't say Americans hate education or are uneducated, because just 38.7% or so of them have bachelor's degrees, right? Compared to, Black Americans, 29.6%, right? Let me read the stats, the data. I'm just going to refer to the data directly. So it's 29.6% of Black adults over 25 years hold a bachelor's degree. 9% of those have a master's degree, and 1.6% of them have a doctoral degree. Now, so if in terms of numbers, right, 29.6% of Black adults represent over 8.67 million individuals. And for 1.6% of Black adults, Black Americans who have a PhD, that's roughly 461,000 Black Americans. That's a lot, right? Considering the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery and presidents like Woodrow Wilson, who are still advocating in the 20th century that blacks should not be taught to read, right? And disenfranchising them, removing them, divesting them of professional jobs in the civil service and leadership roles, like, removing them as ambassadors to Haiti and Liberia and replacing them with white people. So understand the context. For white Americans, like I said, 38.7% of white Americans over 25 years old have a bachelor's degree, and 13.1% of them have a master's degree, 2% with a PhD, right? Those numbers are fairly comparable. Yes, they're lower. Black Americans' educational attainment level, 29.6%, of course, is lower than 38.7% of American population generally, but it's not a gaping difference, right? It's not enormous, it's not massive, right? To say, well, a group that has a 29.6% bachelor's attainment level is totally uneducated, while a group with 38.7% of bachelor's degrees attainment is educated. So just placing these things in context, I'm going to continue my discussion on Black Americans not being a monolith, so that first generation African Americans, first generation, it's a mouthful, it's very confusing how to express it, but first generation Nigerian Americans and Africans from, first generation Americans who become Americans, nationals, or including even the undocumented persons from Africa, do not misunderstand Black Americans, and they don't buy the pejorative tropes against Black Americans as being anti-education or poverty-stricken or hating education, or not exploiting the opportunities in America, while they believe that they're better positioned to exploit the opportunities in America. So understand the historical context. That's what I'm trying to do. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.